All right, continuing on. We are moving from the architecture of Islamic architecture from the Ottoman Empire. We're moving eastward to Iran and the Persian Empire, and we're going to go through India, and that will end the chapter 11, chapter 12 work on the architecture of Islam. And you're welcome to pick from those of you who have already written your essay and submitted. That's wonderful. And those of you who have not, you're welcome to pick from the prior lecture from this week, the architecture of Islam, focusing on the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. Or you can pick from any of the slides that I'll be posting by the time you're listening to this lecture. The slides will also be posted on Canvas. You're welcome to pick from any of the slides from this lecture and write the essay number 2, which is the same format as all the other essays and the exam, with the one requirement being relaxed of having to use all of 3 vocabulary words. You don't have to use 3 vocabulary words in this essay. You will for the exam next week. And I will post a review before I open the assignment for the exam, which I believe is due next Thursday. But for now, let's stay focused. Let's write the second essay assignment, which is due, I believe, by midnight Friday. Okay, jumping in. The Persian Empire is first and foremost along the Silk Road that travels kind of east and west through the Asian continent. And so they are the benefactor, like most other empires and regions that we've been studying. They're the benefactor of a lot of income and money flowing through as a result of trade. And so there's a lot of money to be used, and as the empire is establishing itself, there is no limit on resource, because the empire is thriving economically in being able to use the income and the fruits of that, the economic benefit, to perpetuate highly detailed, large scale, urban scale public spaces for the advancement of the empire. So the first project we're going to look at is this one, which is Masjid-e-Jami, which is the Old Friday Mosque. So one of the things that Shah Abbas, who is probably the most prominent leader in terms of the production of architecture in in the history of the Persian Empire, one of the things that he does is launches a large scale urban renewal campaign to establish the capital of the Persian Empire at Isfahan. Isfahan, Isfahan, which is still a considerably large, I think the second, or probably the second, if not definitely the third largest city in all of Iran. And this is the Friday Mosque, the Old Friday Mosque. Was originally built in the 720s, got rebuilt in the 11th century, and again is built by Shah Abbas. The couple kind of character defining things to call your attention to is the Mukarnas, which is the term that I introduced in the last lecture. And it's basically the elaborate detailing and the transition, the volumetric transition from a vertical plane onto a horizontal projection of that vertical plane as the plane moves up to the central or the upper dome portion. So you can see the elaborate work at the Mukarnas at all three of these elements. Now, there's a new vocabulary term I want to introduce as well. Well, actually, two that I can introduce on this slide. One, which is the Iwan, Iwan. And the Iwan is a three-dimensional, really, it's an entry portal. But the book's definition, the more sort of detailed definition, is that it is a volumetric transition to enter, often found in Islamic architecture, that is enclosed on three sides. So enclosed, 1, 2 is the back side, 3 is the left side, and it's open on one side, and that's the side you generally enter from or through. Walled at three sides, open on one end, usually vaulted. Highly characteristic Persian architectural version of the Iwan is flat on one side, sort of square or even rectangular in proportion, and then flanked by minarets, as you're seeing in the Iwan straight away. To the left and to the right, the minarets are absent, but the minarets are these slender tower-like elements, which are very similar to the tiered minarets that we saw from the architecture of the Ottoman Empire from the last lecture. At Shah Abbas's Masjid al-Jami, and really all of the work that we're going to look at today, there is a high use of ornamented mosaic pattern and detail and pattern work on the facade. Lots of symbolism, lots of text. And so the building is itself a symbol, but also the host for a lot of symbol and message. There's a view of the dome on the inside of the mosque, Shah Abbas Friday Mosque. Here is a close-up view of one of the mukarnas, and you can see how just the delicate and really impressive way that the tiered buildup and the carving of layers, but also like the creation of, there's the flat archway that you walk through with the pointed arch here. Really, there's two volumes here. There's this kind of initial volume that is what you see as you're approaching from straight ahead, but as you're kind of walking through, you encounter this sort of second volume even beyond, and all of this kind of theater is unfolding before you even entered the mosque. So there's no lack of visual interest and visual and volumetric sort of stimulation as you are approaching and observing and kind of moving through the architecture of the 15th, 16th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries in the Persian Empire. And that point about drama is actually very important and coming at the right time, because we are about to enter here in the next week or two. We're going to do the Protestant Reformation first, which is actually going to be a drastic reduction and almost an absolute simplification architecturally, which has a lot of interesting things that will happen to our architecture in the Protestant Reformation. But immediately after the Protestant Reformation, we're going to land in the Baroque, and that use of architecture as theater, as drama, as just kind of over the top stimulation, sensory stimulation, is going to be something that's going to come right back to us, as I mentioned, in probably 2 weeks when we get back into the Baroque. So kind of make a mental note of that, and we'll be back to this kind of high drama architecture here very soon. So there's another view of another Iwan and another Mukarnas, and then another pair of paired minarets that flank the entry Iwan into the Shah Abbas Mosque. Sorry, the Masjid El Jami Mosque, Friday Mosque. Same motif there. There's a painted depiction. Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out, kind of linking the last 3 chapters together of China, the Ottoman Empire, and now architecture of the Persian Empire, and also we're going to cover India a little bit here today, is the use of negative space. So we see again the framing of really a void space in the middle that has a small water feature set in the middle of it, but this kind of framing of that space in the middle, which is really nothing, becomes starts to have a very important role in the experience of the entry, the procession, and as you move about this space and how it frames, views of the respective sides. Let's see. I'm going to fast forward a couple slides to show you a plan of this next project, which is the Shah Abbas Mosque, which is the sort of crown jewel of the work that Shah Abbas did. I mentioned earlier the kind of urban renewal and the reestablishment of Isfahan as the capital of the Persian Empire. And this project, the Shah Abbas Mosque, is really kind of the most prominent work of architecture of all of the buildings in the new capital of Isfahan. But what I want to go to quickly is the plan. So this is a plan of the Shah Abbas Mosque. The dates, let me give you the dates: 1611, crown jewel of the urban renewal. The architect of really all of Shah Abbas's work is Sheikh Bahai. I'll spell it. It's SHAYKH BAHAI, Sheikh Bahai. Prominently used in some of the subsequent slides that you're going to see is what is referred to as a 7-color mosaic. So there was this kind of rapid effort to, before the death of Shah Abbas, to kind of complete the work of the rebuilding of this capital. And so there was a sort of frenetic pace through which they were trying to realize these multiple buildings, this broad kind of grand avenue that connects them all, which I'm not really going to get into today. And so as a result, there was a lot of efficiencies that were utilized in order to complete this work before the death of Shah Abbas. And so one of the techniques was the use of what the Persians refer to as 7-color mosaics. So there's a high use of color and a high use of sort of saturation of color. Bright colors, not muted colors necessarily. But if you look carefully, the use of that color is actually limited to 7 colors. And that was one of the sort of strategies, I should say, that they employed in order to get more built faster. To me, one of the most interesting things I like to point out, and I kind of have learned from the Shah Abbas Mosque, is it's one of the most salient examples that I see of this juxtaposition of diagonal geometry against orthogonal geometry. And it's interesting to look at in plan for sure. And you can kind of get a sense of this sort of colonnade that brings you from either side to this entry E1. This is an E1 that you're looking at here. But really what I want to call your attention to is this entrance into the mosque on a bias, so on an angle. So rather than approach symmetrically, which is pretty much all of the work, the formal work, especially the former religious work that we've been looking at so far, with one exception. I don't know if you guys will remember, but the project that I showed from the section on the architecture of Russia, I believe it's a church in the Ukraine where you enter the sanctuary not from the narthex, but you actually enter from the side aisle, from one of the two side aisles. You can actually only enter it from one side. But with the exception of that project, pretty much all of the religious and civic architecture that we've been looking at, we approach symmetrically on center, which is different from what we're seeing here at Shah Abbas Mosque, in that we're approaching from an angle and then we're recentering immediately upon entry, but we're approaching from a diagonal. That's also something that's going to come up in the Baroque. That's a sort of a common thing to sort of break from the tradition and the symmetry of approaching something from the middle and actually, kind of moving alongside it rather than moving directly to it, being framed symmetrically on center. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to show the plan, but also to give a sense of the detail and the carving of the volume into so many subsections. Really, the processional is what I wanted to articulate. So we kind of move through the E1, which is one set of experiences in and of itself. When I'm moving through a space that has this amount of craft, detail, surface, articulation, proportion and scale, clearly past. We talked earlier in the first couple weeks about this notion of transcending the human scale. Clearly, this transcends the human scale. So there's lots of things at play just in the entry sequence alone, and that all is happening here. Then we're moving through a space that's kind of pinching as we're moving through. So the space is kind of closing on us as we move through. Then we're in, and we move through another framed opening, and that triangulated space is basically where, which is, I would say, the fourth space that we're moving through. And finally, in that fourth space is where we're reoriented on symmetry and then inside the mosque. So this sort of start to read the sequencing of how we move through space as well, and that's going to become more and more important as we move through and advance in the future sections of the Baroque, and then actually in modern architecture, and even in the contemporary work that we're going to look at the end of the semester. So I wanted to point that out. Muqarnas, we've looked at plenty of examples. I think I led actually with a close-up detail of this Muqarnas work, which is to me the most outstanding example anywhere in the world of that element, of that detail. And then this is the inside, and the book refers to it as a hypostyle hall, which is basically a hall that is adorned and occupied by heavy, dense, wide columns that are sequenced kind of closer together than not. So more volume is taken by the column surface than would be in other more slender arrangements of columns. it's a reference to the architecture of ancient Egypt, the hypostyle hall, where sometimes you would have a building where 60% of the floor surface area is actually taken up by the mass of the columns. You'd have these heavy, wide diameter columns that are very close together, and it creates a different kind of a spatial experience than the sort of open plan with slender columns in the middle, in which maybe 5% of the surface area of the floor plan is taken up by the column structure. So on the heavier side, hypostyle hall motif. We looked at the Mukarnas. There's a plan. There's kind of an axonometric view, so you sort of get a sense of kind of what's happening spatially here. Is we can move through here, we can move through this way, and then we go through that sequence of moving through 2 or 3 secondary, tertiary spaces, and then that's when we're reoriented towards the main axis of symmetry here. Okay, and so moving now from the Persian Empire to India, which is our kind of last exploration east as we move back towards Europe. And there's a strong relationship in terms of trade, in terms of politics, and even in terms of the sort of marriage in the royalty of these two countries or nation states of the Persian Empire and India. So this first project we're looking at is called Fatehpur Sikri. I'll spell it. It's Fatehpur, Fatehpur Sikri, India, 1580. Some similarities that should jump out right away. You're looking at an Iwan, which is a Islamic architectural characteristic element, closed on 3 sides, open on one side, pointed arch, and the space that brings you in, and you enter basically the mosque through. Built by Akbar the Great, who's the ruler at this time, similar to what Shah Abbas is doing in the Persian Empire, who's reestablishing Esfahan as a capital. What Akbar the Great is doing is he's establishing Gujarat as the sort of capital of India, and so undertaking a very serious campaign of building and architecture. Large courtyard. Let's see, the Iwan into the mosque. And in the courtyard that faces Fatehpur Sikri, so Fatehpur Sikri is this collection of buildings, which includes the Buland Darwaza, Buland, Buland Darwaza, Darwaza. So Buland Darwaza is one of the buildings. The building that you're seeing here to the right is the tomb of Sheikh Salim, Shaykh Salim. So there's a tomb, there's a large expansive courtyard, there is a mosque or an entry Iwan into a mosque that you're looking at, and there's an educational building on the opposite side of the courtyard, which we're not really going to get into, but it's this sort of collection of civic buildings, not unlike the civic spaces that we saw in the last lecture in the Ottoman Empire. Hypostyle hall, similar to what we looked at on the interior of Shah Abbas Mosque. Colonnade with sort of repeating motifs that, if you kind of break it down into the general massing and the forms, it's not unlike the work that we saw in humanist early Renaissance. It's not going to be unlike the some of the work that you've seen maybe in Gothic architecture in prior classes, or not too different from some of the work that we're going to see in the Baroque from a massing standpoint and a kind of a functional standpoint. What's different, though, is the articulation, the geometry, and the sort of faceting of the columns, which is a unique thing. And I wanted to point that out because the book also makes reference to this. And that's what makes some of the work that you're looking at here and that you're going to see in the next few slides in the architecture in India distinct, and what makes it contextually Indian is these details, the faceting details, have their basis in the architecture of the Gujarat region of India, and specifically the Jain monuments, the Jain monuments, which go back a couple thousand years, and they're architectural elements that were found, and I think were built by the people I believe were referred to as the Jains. So there's these monuments, sort of historic monuments that they're building, some of which are preserved and are still around in and around the Gujarat region in India. The religious architecture being built 1600 years later, in these cases in the 16th century, 1570 is what you're looking at here. There's an homage being paid to that kind of historical architectural motif. And that's what makes this work in this slide and the prior slide and the subsequent slides distinctly Indian. It's grounded in the architectural, the geometric history of this part of the world, and these kind of faceting details that you see on the columns, and the materials, and the use of brick and clay. This was interesting. This was from the book. I had noticed this image before, but I hadn't paid careful attention to what the book was pointing out. But there's, if you can kind of remember back to the principles of humanism in the early Renaissance, of visibility of the royalty and the clergy and the sort of high-ranking officials and the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not the dignitaries, but sort of diplomatic class. The importance of the visibility of those people. Well, the same thing is happening in India in this time frame, 16th century, and specifically architectural devices are being used to convey that idea. Specifically, this terrace that you're looking at here is considered Akbar's terrace, and this is the terrace that Akbar would use to basically show his face publicly on a daily basis. I think the book even said 2 or 3 times a day, which was something that he insisted as part of his style, as part of his leadership style, is to make himself visible to his subjects or to his people. And so, architecture is being used to sort of help host that function. So Akbar's terrace. There you see again the bracketing detail that has its origins in the architectural history of Gujarat and the Jain monuments as well. There's a close-up of that incredible detailing. There's an old Jain monument that's been partially restored, but an old monument nonetheless. And so you can see kind of the similarities, the sort of reduction as we move up. The faceted geometry, very planar geometry, or very, I would say, orthogonal geometry. And then finally, the Itimad ud Dawla, Itimad Itimad ud Dawla, 17th century, built 1628, and really a tomb for Akbar's wife, who was Nur Jahan, Nurjahan, Nur Jahan, who was Persian and whose parents were Persian. So again, this kind of link and this connection between Persian Empire and India. Nur Jahan is Persian born, and her parents are Persian, and she marries into the Indian royalty and marries Akbar, and she commissions this work of architecture to basically be the tomb for her mother and father in India. And you should see the similarities here probably to Taj Mahal and some of the other more kind of popular work that we know India to be associated with. But this is the tomb for Nur Jahan's Persian parents. Use of white marble, use of iconography, use of mosaic on the facade. We see the pointed arches, obviously, clean kind of an entry sequence, flanked by pointed arch niches on either side, minarets, slightly wider characteristically than what we saw for sure in the architecture of the Ottoman Empire, but even also, I would say, change in proportion to a kind of a wider and maybe even a shorter proportion relative to what we saw in the work of the architects of the Persian Empire. Bracketing, tiers also. So I would describe these as being a triple tiered minaret: base tier, middle tier, upper tier. The bracketing that you're seeing, even some similarity there with what we saw in the architecture of China, and the white marble and minarets. Again, I want to point out the entry sequence here as we approach this work. Although the entrance itself is centered, this is an intriguing idea, and again, this is repeated at the Taj Mahal as well. But you are approaching either from the left or from the right, and then you're only recentering at the very end when you get up to the main, the upper kind of plinth level from the base at which you approach. So I've emphasized it, and I haven't emphasized it enough because it plays such an important role, but the use of the ground plane, the idea that you're approaching for hundreds of yards before you get to this building on a completely different ground plane that you only shift as you're approaching the building at the very end, I think says something very important about the notion of formality and the notion of sort of changing perspective and changing focus as you move ground plane only at the very end before you enter this highly formal space, one, but also a space that probably the architects intend to evoke contemplation and maybe respect and solemnness to some degree. So that's it. I wanted to keep this lecture short. This is the last of Islamic architecture. This rounds out our movement through really the continent of Asia. Welcome to pick from any of these slides, or again, the slides I had lectured on a couple days ago for essay number 2. I look forward to reading them. And next will be a review before the exam next week. I will post probably a 30 to 45 minute review. And then next Thursday morning, I believe, when the exam assignment opens up, you will have access to the slides. There'll be 4 projects from the lectures of the past 2.5 weeks. You'll pick one and you'll write about it. And for that one, you will be required to use the vocabulary words, and you will have the vocabulary words posted on Canvas, and I will go over them again in the review, just like I did in the prior exam. Thank you for your attention. Let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to reading your essays.